The wind came down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains like something alive. It didn't blow across the San Luis Valley. It pressed into it, rolling south off the high ridges at 7,600 feet of elevation, carrying the kind of cold that doesn't settle gently, but arrives as a verdict. October 1879. The aspens along the creek beds had already lost their leaves 2 weeks early. The old-timers at the general store in Alamosa said they hadn't seen frost that hard before Halloween in 15 years. They nursed their coffee and agreed. It was going to be a brutal winter. Nobody was paying particular attention to the homestead at the edge of the valley's east bench. There was nothing remarkable about it. Not yet. A modest claim of 160 acres, a lean-to for a mule, a garden plot that had given up its last squash the week before. What was unusual, if anyone had bothered to look closely, was the woman standing at the south-facing slope behind the property with a long-handled shovel in both hands and a wooden stake driven into the frozen earth in front of her. Her name was Maren Elstead. She was 31 years old. She had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Court Elstead, had died of a lung infection the previous August, leaving her with the claim, 2 draft horses, a half-built root cellar, and a log cabin that, as Maren well knew after her first Colorado winter, was about as effective at keeping out cold as a wool blanket nailed to a doorframe. She looked at the stake. She looked at the slope. She exhaled slowly, watching the fog of her own breath hang and dissolve in the mountain air. Then she began to dig. If you've never heard of Maren Elstead, that's exactly the problem. What she built that autumn, with her own hands, without a single hired carpenter, without a cent of outside investment, would quietly outperform every log cabin in the valley for the next 3 winters. The local builder who called it a grave with a door would later cross the valley in February to beg her to explain how she'd done it. This is that story. If you want to receive a real, proven survival technique like this one every single week, techniques that worked when lives actually depended on them, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because what Maren understood about heat, earth, and physics in 1879 is something most modern homes still get completely wrong. To understand why Maren did what she did, you first have to understand what she was dealing with. The standard frontier cabin of the Colorado high desert in the 1870s was a marvel of improvisation and a disaster of thermal engineering. It was typically built from hand-hewn pine or cottonwood logs, chinked with a mixture of mud and grass or horsehair plaster. The walls were, at best, 8 to 10 inches thick. The floor was either bare earth or rough-hewn planking laid directly on the ground with no insulating gap beneath it. The single fireplace, or cast-iron box stove, sat against one wall, radiated heat in a cone in front of it, and sent the vast majority of its thermal energy straight up the chimney, flue, and out into the night. Oral accounts recorded by the Costilla County Historical Society describe families in the San Luis Valley burning through between 9 and 14 cords of wood per winter. That's roughly 36,000 to 56,000 pounds of firewood, just to keep interior temperatures above freezing during the worst cold snaps. A cord of wood, for those unfamiliar, is a stacked pile 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. Cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking 14 of those required weeks of physical labor before winter even began. Maren had cut 2.5 cords. That was what she'd managed alone after Court died. 2.5 cords, a mule, and a cabin that lost most of its heat through the floor and the ceiling gap above the loft. She had done the math. At the rate the cabin burned through wood during the previous winter, when Court was still alive and running 2 stoves, 2.5 cords would last her approximately until mid-January. After that, she would either have to beg wood from neighbors, burn furniture, or freeze. None of those options were acceptable, so Maren didn't try to make the cabin more efficient. She decided to build something entirely different, something that didn't rely on burning wood to stay warm at all. The idea had come to her, not from books, but from memory. She had grown up in Minnesota, and her grandmother, a Norwegian immigrant who had homesteaded in the 1840s, had told her about Jordsjord, earth houses dug into hillsides that stayed ice-free through the deepest Scandinavian winters, not because anyone heated them, but because the ground itself kept them from freezing. She had never forgotten the description. The earth holds what the sky cannot take away. Standing at the south-facing slope on the east bench of her property, with the wind pressing at her back and the Sangre de Cristos going purple in the dusk, Maren Elstad decided to let the earth hold her through the winter. What she designed was not a cave. It was not a dugout in the primitive sense. It was a precisely engineered semi-subterranean shelter that used thermal mass, passive solar gain, and convective air circulation to maintain a livable interior temperature, principles that modern building scientists would later codify under terms like earth-sheltered construction and passive solar design. In 1879, Maren just called it the Hill House. The people of Alamosa called it something else entirely. The first thing Maren did was choose the slope carefully. A south-facing hillside in the northern hemisphere receives the maximum amount of winter sunlight. The sun tracks low across the southern sky from November through February, and a slope angled toward it acts as a passive solar collector. Maren's chosen site faced roughly 15 degrees east of due south, which local accounts suggest was intentional. It would catch the early morning sun and begin warming before the coldest pre-dawn hours had fully settled in. She excavated a rectangular space approximately 16 feet wide by 22 feet deep into the slope, going down 4 feet below grade at the back wall and tapering to ground level at the front. This took her 11 days working alone with a pick and 2 shovels. The excavated soil she piled onto the earthen roof form she constructed from a framework of pine poles and split cottonwood planking, building up an insulating layer that would eventually reach 18 to 20 inches of compacted earth above the ceiling joists. The walls were built from a combination of stacked sod blocks, cut from the valley floor in 12-inch by 18-inch sections, and dry-laid sandstone gathered from the creek bed, roughly 14 inches thick at their thinnest point. The critical thermal principle here was mass. A 14-inch sandstone and sod wall absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly through the night, acting as a thermal battery that smooths out temperature fluctuations. Modern thermal mass calculations suggest that Maren's walls, at their full construction weight, stored somewhere between 3,500 and 4,500 BTUs per degree Fahrenheit of temperature swing, a figure comparable to a small masonry heater. The roof's 18-inch soil cap provided an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, estimated between R18 and R22, roughly comparable to modern spray foam insulation and far superior to the chinked log cabins R2 to R4 walls. The south face of the structure featured a single large window opening, which Maren glazed using 2 layers of oiled linen stretch taut over the frame, a technique she'd seen used in Minnesota. This double-layer assembly trapped a thin air gap between the layers, adding insulation while still transmitting enough diffuse light to make the interior livable during daylight hours. Direct solar gain through that window on a clear December day would have delivered meaningful heat energy directly onto the stone floor inside. Inside, against the north wall, the wall deepest in the hillside, Maren built a small stone mass heater. Not a fireplace, a mass heater, a densely constructed box of stacked limestone, roughly 3 feet wide by 4 feet tall, with a firebox at its base, a serpentine internal flue channel that forced combustion gases to travel through multiple horizontal passages before exiting through a simple vertical chimney pipe, and a flat top surface that served as a radiant panel. The serpentine channel was the key. It extracted heat from the exhaust gases over a long contact path, rather than letting that heat escape directly up a straight flue and deposited it into the stone mass. The stone then radiated that heat slowly and evenly for hours after the fire was extinguished. The total stone mass of the heater, approximately 900 pounds. The total combustible would require to bring it to operating temperature and charge it fully. 3 to 5 pounds of dry hardwood, roughly what you could carry in one arm. This was the design. From the outside, it looked like a hillside with a door. From the inside, it was a calculated thermal system built by a woman who had never read an engineering manual but understood in her bones how heat moved and where it went. The experts of Alamosa, when they eventually heard about it, were not impressed. Word traveled the way it always did in small frontier settlements, carried on wagons, passed at the general store counter, relayed at Sunday services. By late October, most of Alamosa knew that the Elstead widow had done something peculiar out on the East Bench. They didn't know the details. They didn't need to. Digging into a hillside was enough to form a complete opinion. The most vocal critic was a man named Devereux Hamel. Hamel was 47, had been building frontier structures in the Colorado Territory for 19 years, and considered himself, not without some justification, the most experienced builder in the San Luis Valley. He had constructed 24 log cabins, 3 commercial buildings, a church, and a schoolhouse. He knew timber. He knew chinking. He knew how a proper flue drew air and how a proper cabin weathered a Colorado winter. He had never built anything underground. When a freighter named Orson Pruitt described what he'd seen at the Elstead property, the excavation, the sod walls, the thin chimney pipe, Hamel reportedly set down his coffee, exhaled through his nose, and said 6 words that would follow him for the rest of his life. That woman has built herself a grave. He expanded on the theme when pressed. The roof would collapse under the weight of the soil. No roof plate and rafter assembly was designed to carry that load, especially not once the spring snowpack added its weight on top. The oiled linen window would rot before January. The sod walls would wick moisture from the ground, saturate, and crumble. The so-called mass heater, Hamel had heard about the serpentine flue, was going to backdraft and fill the shelter with smoke. He'd seen similar amateur attempts at heat storage before. They always smoked. They always failed. No proper draw, he told a group at the hardware store. You need height and straight pull. You put bends in a flue, you kill the draft. First cold night, she tries to light that thing. She's going to be sleeping in the barn. The hardware store owner, a man called Rufus Seeger, added the social dimension that Hamel had left tactfully unspoken. It's not a house, Seeger said, to general agreement. A house has walls you can see. A house sits on the ground, not in it. What she's built is a root cellar with pretensions. A local rancher passing through said simply, "My hogs winter better than that." Merritt heard all of it. She continued working. She reinforced the roof plate with an additional beam, doubled the rafter spacing, and added a drainage channel around the perimeter of the structure to prevent ground moisture from migrating into the base of the sod walls. She adjusted the height and angle of the chimney pipe to improve the thermal draft once the mass heater reached operating temperature. She packed additional dry grass between the outer sod layer and the stone wall as a capillary break against moisture migration. Then she moved in on November 3rd, 1879, while Devereux Hamel was still cutting the last of his firewood for the season, stacking his tent core behind the cabin he'd built himself, the cabin with the proper log walls and the straight-draw fireplace, and the floor that would be 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius by morning every day from December through March. What happened between December 1879 and February 1880 in the San Luis Valley was not a typical Colorado winter. The Rocky Mountain region experienced one of its most severe cold cycles in recorded memory during that period. Regional weather records, preserved in fragmentary form through the journals of the Territorial Surveyor's Office and corroborated by accounts in the Rio Grande Republican newspaper, describe sustained cold that drove temperatures to between minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius to minus 32 degrees Celsius during the worst stretches of January. A mid-December blizzard dropped 31 inches of snow in 4 days and left the valley floor drifted to 6 and 7 feet in exposed areas. The Arkansas River froze solid 60 miles to the north. Ranchers reported losing cattle that had been inside covered pens. The log cabins of Alamosa and the surrounding valley began to struggle almost immediately. The fundamental problem was this: a fire in a standard frontier fireplace or cast iron stove creates a convective cycle. Hot air rises, cold air floods in at floor level to replace it, and the net effect is that the coldest air in the room stays at floor level, exactly where the occupants' feet are. The fireplace draws that cold air in through every gap, crack, and poorly fitted door. On nights of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius, Even a large fire burning at full output struggled to keep a log cabin's interior above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius at chest height, while the floor temperature hovered near 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius, and frost formed on the interior wall, chinking by midnight. Families began burning through their wood supplies at a catastrophic rate. A cabin that might have managed on 8 or 9 cords in a normal winter needed 12, 13, 14 to stay livable in this one. By late January, oral accounts indicate that several families in the valley had exhausted their stores and were burning fence rails, barn boards, and furniture. Orson Pruitt, the freighter who had first carried news of Marin's construction to Hamel, crossed the East Bench on January 14th with a load of supplies. He would later describe what he saw, or rather, what he didn't see, to anyone who asked. He didn't see smoke, not a column, not a wisp, just the faintest shimmer of heat-distorted air above the small chimney pipe. He thought the shelter must be abandoned. He climbed down from the wagon seat and knocked on the low door, half expecting silence. Marin answered in her work clothes, warm, unhurried. The interior temperature, by Pruitt's account, was like a springtime kitchen. You walked in and your fingers stopped hurting. He asked how much she'd burned. She pointed to a stack beside the heater. A third of a cord, maybe a little less. It was January 14th. Stay with me, because the numbers she recorded by the end of February are going to dismantle everything Devereux Hamel believed about warmth, wood, and what a house is supposed to be. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every week, a technique like this one, real, tested, built by people who had no margin for failure. Hit subscribe and you won't miss it. Orson Pruitt was not a man given to exaggeration. He had spent 17 years hauling freight across the Colorado Territory, through mountain passes, across flooded creek crossings, through hailstorms that dented sheet tin, and he had developed, as a matter of professional survival, a preference for plainly stating what he observed and nothing more. So when he started talking, people listened. He told the story at the general store on January 16th, 2 days after his visit to Marin's shelter. He described the interior temperature, warm enough to work without a coat. He described the wood stack, barely touched after 2 full months of winter. He described the floor, dry, stone set, noticeably warmer underfoot than the plank floors in any cabin he'd been inside that season. Rufus Seeger, the hardware store owner who had called the shelter a root cellar with pretensions, asked the question everyone was thinking. How cold did it get inside on those January nights? Pruitt said he didn't know the exact number, but Marin did. She had been keeping a written record. The document, a small leather-bound journal that passed through several hands after Marin's death in 1921 and was eventually donated to a county historical archive, contains temperature readings taken twice daily throughout the winter of 1879 to 80. The measurements were made using a mercury thermometer that had belonged to her husband, calibrated in Fahrenheit, and recorded alongside brief weather notations in Marin's precise, unhurried handwriting. The numbers are worth sitting with. On the night of January 9th, 1880, the coldest recorded night of that winter, when the external temperature dropped to an estimated minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius. The interior of Marin's earth shelter registered 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius at midnight. No fire had been lit since early that morning. The mass heater had been charged with approximately 4 pounds of dry pine at 6 a.m., burned for roughly 90 minutes, and then allowed to cool and radiate. 16 hours later, with temperatures outside approaching minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, the stone mass was still releasing stored heat into the room at a rate sufficient to hold the interior 80 degrees above the outdoor temperature. 80 degrees of differential, without a single active flame. On days when Marin ran the heater for a full morning burn, 3 to 4 hours, consuming between 6 and 9 pounds of dry wood, the interior climbed to between 78 degrees Fahrenheit and 83 degrees Fahrenheit, 25 to 28 degrees Celsius, by early afternoon, and held above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius, until well past midnight. The floor temperature, measured at ankle height near the center of the room, never dropped below 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius during the entire winter, a figure that would have been considered extraordinary in any log cabin in the valley, where floor temperatures of 35 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, were accepted as simply the nature of winter mornings. The comparison with neighboring structures was not subtle. Devereux Hamel's own cabin, the one he had built himself, with 19 years of experience behind every log and every chinking line, maintained a mean overnight temperature of between 44 degrees Fahrenheit and 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 11 degrees Celsius, during the same January cold snap, according to his wife Nell's account recorded decades later by a local historian. They burned through their 11th cord of wood on February 2nd and began rationing on February 7th. A family named Brecker, homesteading 3 miles south of Marin on the valley floor, burned their last cord on January 28th and spent the final 3 weeks of February sleeping in shifts to maintain a fire watch, burning split fence posts and a dismantled outbuilding. Marin Elstead reached the 1st of March with 3/4 of a cord of wood remaining. She had entered the winter with 2.5 cords. She burned, by her own accounting, approximately 1 cord and 3/4 across the entire season, including the mild weeks of November and the relatively temperate spells of early December. During the brutal core of the winter, from December 15th through February 20th, her total wood consumption was less than 1 cord. Her neighbors, in equivalent structures on equivalent land, had burned between 9 and 13. The stone mass heater had performed exactly as its design demanded. The serpentine flue, the one Hamel had said would kill the draft, extracted so much heat from the combustion gases that the exhaust exiting the chimney pipe was barely warm to the touch. Nearly all of the fuel's thermal energy went into the stone. Nearly all of the stone's stored energy went into the room. Almost nothing was wasted. The earth walls absorbed daytime solar gain through the south window, stored it in their mass through the afternoon, and released it slowly through the night. The 18-inch soil cap above the ceiling performed as insulation so effective that frost never formed on the interior ceiling surface, a problem so common in log cabins that most frontier families considered it simply a fact of winter. One number above all others traveled through Alamosa and planted itself in people's minds, 80 degrees warmer inside than outside. Without a fire, no one laughed after that. The first sign that something had shifted came in early March. Devereux Hamel appeared at the East Bench on a Tuesday morning, alone, driving a small wagon. He did not send word ahead. He tied his horse to a fence post, walked to the low door of the shelter, and knocked. Marin opened it. By her later account, relayed through her daughter Sigrid's letters, Hamel stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the warmth on his face from inside, and said nothing. Then he asked if he could come in and look at the heater. She stepped aside. He spent 40 minutes inside the shelter, moving slowly from the south window to the north wall, crouching to examine the floor stones, running his hand along the sod wall, and eventually kneeling in front of the mass heater and studying the firebox opening and the chimney collar. He asked Marin questions in a low, careful voice about the depth of the excavation, the thickness of the soil cap, the composition of the mortar she'd used to set the limestone courses in the heater's body. She answered each one. Before he left, he stood in the doorway again and looked back at the room. He didn't apologize. That was not the frontier way, and Marin apparently didn't expect it. But the accounts agree on what he said. We didn't fight the cold. You just made it irrelevant. He was back 2 weeks later with a younger man named Calvin Price, a carpenter's apprentice who had just started building his own claim. Hamel walked Price through the structure the way a teacher walks a student through a proof, pointing at each element and explaining what it did. Marin served them coffee and answered questions for an hour. By April, Price had broken ground on an earth-sheltered addition to the north side of his cabin, using the hillside behind his property the same way Marin had used hers. He substituted adobe brick for sod in the walls, a material more readily available on his claim, but followed Marin's proportions for wall thickness and roof soil depth closely. Hamel himself did not rebuild. He was too invested in his existing structures. But local accounts suggest he began recommending earth berming, piling excavated soil against the exterior north and west walls of log cabins to reduce wind exposure and improve thermal mass, to every client he took on after the winter of 1879 to 80. It was a partial application of what Marin had done, adapted to the conventional building methods he already knew. He never publicly credited her by name, but the technique entered his practice and stayed there. By the winter of 1881 to 82, records held at the Costilla County Historical Society indicate that at least 11 homesteads within a 40-mile radius of Alamosa had incorporated some form of earth sheltering, soil berming, or stone mass heating derived, directly or indirectly, from what Marin Elstead had built alone on the East Bench in the autumn of 1879. Several of those homesteaders had visited her shelter in person. Others had heard the description secondhand and reconstructed the principles from Pruitt's account and Hamill's revised building recommendations. None of them called it a grave with a door anymore. The phrase that circulated instead, recorded in at least 2 letters from the period, was simpler and more accurate. They called it the Warm Hill. It became, in the valley's vernacular, both a description and a category, built like the Warm Hill. A shorthand for any structure that used the earth itself as the primary thermal system, that stored heat rather than constantly generating it, that worked with the physics of mass and insulation rather than trying to overpower the cold with raw combustion. Marin kept the shelter as her primary residence for 7 more winters. Her wood consumption never exceeded 2 cords in any of them. In the spring of 1887, she built a second structure using the same principles, larger this time. 4 rooms, a proper stone floor, a double mass heater share between the main living space and the sleeping area. Her daughter Sigrid was born in that building in December 1887. Marin later wrote that the room temperature when Sigrid arrived was 74 degrees Fahrenheit, 23 degrees Celsius. Outside, it was 11 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 12 degrees Celsius. She hadn't lit a fire since mid-morning. There's a particular kind of knowledge that doesn't live in books. It lives in the hands of people who had to get things right the first time, because if they didn't get a second chance. It lives in the logic of necessity, in the solutions that emerge not from theory, but from the intersection of a real problem, a limited set of materials, and a mind clear enough to see what the problem actually is. Marin Elstead was not a physicist. She had not studied thermodynamics. She had no access to the work of Fourier on heat conduction, or Rumford on fireplace efficiency, or any of the European masonry heater traditions that were producing remarkably similar results in Scandinavia and Russia during the same decades. She arrived at her understanding through a different route. The remembered description of a Norwegian grandmother's earth house, a careful observation of where heat went and why, and 11 days of digging alone in frozen ground because she had run out of alternatives. What she understood, intuitively, empirically, without the vocabulary, was a cluster of physical principles that modern building science now considers foundational. The first is thermal mass. Dense materials, stone, packed earth, water, adobe, absorb heat energy slowly and release it slowly. A 900-pound limestone heater charged with a short, hot fire will continue releasing warmth for 12 to 18 hours after the flames are gone. A log cabin wall with an R value of 2 loses that same warmth in minutes. The difference is not magic. It is physics, specifically the relationship between a material's density, its specific heat capacity, and the rate at which it conducts energy to its surroundings. The second is geothermal stability. At a depth of 4 to 6 feet, soil temperature in most temperate climates stabilizes at somewhere between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 13 degrees Celsius, year-round, regardless of surface conditions. A structure embedded in that zone starts every day from a baseline that is already 70 to 75 degrees warmer than the exterior on a minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit night. It takes only a small thermal input to bridge that remaining gap to comfort. A surface structure, by contrast, starts from ambient exterior temperature and must fight its way to comfort every single morning. The third is convective geometry. A room with low ceilings, no floor drafts, and a radiant heat source at the north wall. rather than a convective source creating a chimney effect, maintains warmth more evenly and more efficiently. Cold air cannot flood in at floor level because the floor is thermally buffered by the earth beneath it. The room behaves as a closed thermal envelope rather than an open one. Marin's design combined all three principles in a structure that required no fuel at all to stay above freezing on most nights, and only a brief daily fire to achieve genuine comfort. The serpentine mass heater extracted somewhere between 70% and 80% of its fuel's thermal energy into the stone, compared to the 15% to 25% efficiency of the average frontier fireplace, and delivered that energy to the room over a period of hours rather than minutes. The critics who called her design primitive, unstable, and dangerous had confused unfamiliarity with incorrectness. They knew how to build the structures they had always built. They did not know how to see a structure that operated on different principles, and so they defaulted to the assumption that those principles were wrong. They were not wrong. They were older, in many ways, than the log cabin tradition that had replaced them. Earth shelter construction had been used by the ancestral Puebloans of the Southwest, by the Norse settlers of Iceland and Greenland, by the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples of the Great Plains, and by dozens of other cultures across centuries and continents, all of whom had arrived at variations of the same conclusion through variations of the same necessity. The earth does not burn. It stores. It radiates. It holds what the sky cannot take away. Maren Elstad did not invent this knowledge. She inherited a fragment of it, recognized its value, and refused to be argued out of it by men who confused loudness with expertise. That distinction between the person who knows a technique and the person who performs confidence about a technique has never been more important than it is today, when the average home in the United States loses between 25% and 40% of its heating energy through improperly insulated walls, floors, and ceiling gaps. And the average homeowner has no idea what thermal mass means or what the temperature of the ground beneath their foundation is at this moment. It is 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. Give or take. It has been all winter. It will be all summer. The earth is waiting. Now it's your turn. Which part of what Maren built would you apply to your own home, or your off-grid setup, your cabin, your homestead? The earth-burned walls? The stone mass heater? The soil roof? Tell me in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from, and what the coldest winter you've ever survived looked like. Every answer teaches someone else something real. And if this story gave you something, a technique, a perspective, a reason to think differently about heat and shelter, then share it with one person who needs it. That's how this knowledge survived for 150 years. Not in institutions, in people passing it forward. Subscribe if you haven't. There's another story like this one waiting for you next week. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.